Okay, now we're ready for the fun stuff. This is the detailed movie chronology order that I've developed through researching all this stuff. And how I'm going to do this, how I'll structure it, is I will put forth the chronology and some points as to why they're placed in that position, and then I'll go to continuity between these the film and other films, and or not just continuity, but major factors that are in the film that will affect later films or previous films. And then lastly, I'll do the debunking of any objections to why I place it where it is, or codename or reboot stuff. Alright, here we go. The first movie, and this is I'm only doing EON franchise Bond films, the 24 of them. And the first one that I have is Daniel Craig's Casino Royale 2006. And this, the continuity, the chronology, the reason for it is because Bond doesn't have his 00 at the beginning. And this is where he receives it. All the other films, he already has his 00, so you can't put those before this one. And there's also no Q shown, though it's possible he might actually exist, but he isn't shown. And Moneypenny isn't shown, but I have a theory about Moneypenny, and I'll briefly talk about that right now. I believe Moneypenny very well could be a code name, but I also think two things. I think Moneypenny is a code name, and the reason is because when Vesper comes onto the plane and sits down with Bond, she says, "I'm the money," and he says, "Every penny of it." And I think that's a hint, because Vesper is the treasurer for Bond's poker endeavor. She holds the money for that. I believe that's the same position that Moneypenny would have. So therefore, I think that Vesper is actually Moneypenny here as the code name. But obviously, because she dies, she is not the consistent Moneypenny. So, but going into talking about the code name Moneypenny, because of my view that race doesn't matter, it's very possible that Eve Moneypenny is the other three Moneypennies: Samantha Bond, Lois Child, and not Lois. That's actually Lois Maxwell. And then there's Caroline Bliss and Naomi Harris. Those four, I believe, are the same. I just do. Can't prove it, but my view that my race, about the race doesn't matter, it's basically like this. And I left this part out of the when I was talking about film theory, but it's basically, there's actors, the same actors that play different characters throughout the films, such as Charles Gray playing Blofeld and Deco Henderson and Joe Don Baker playing. He played that CIA agent in Goldeneye, and I believe it was Tomorrow Never Dies. And then he played that villain in The Living Daylights. Can't think of the Whitaker. Anyways, you have the same actors playing different characters, so there's precedence then to have different actors playing the same character, and which the race issue would fall into. But there's other explanation. You just have to go back. I'm not going to go over that right now. I've already gone over that. But you have the origin of Bond's 00, and M states that she's promoted him to 00 status way too soon. Continuity aspects are that this is the origin of, Bond being a 00, and it's also the origin of the secret organization, and not its beginning, but what we see from its beginning. It's also where, we see continuity of different props, such as the Aston Martin, which is found in the older films, the Vesper Martini, which is in the novel, and it's also the origin of his relationship with Vesper, which we experience vaguely throughout the rest of the films, mostly in the first, or in Craig's 4. And then this film is also the continuity. It's very consistent with the novel, Casino Royale. Moving on from chronology and continuity, we'll go into detail about, debunking objections. Number one, Bond isn't a code name. James Bond isn't. And we see this because Bond receives his 00 here at the very beginning. In fact, Dresden calls Bond Bond before he receives his 00. So once he gets into 00 status, 007 becomes his code name. And he recognizes him as James Bond and no other name. He doesn't call him by another name. He recognizes that it's Bond. Also, Bond uses a code name in the movie with Le Chiffre when he goes to the card game, and it's Arlington Beach. And he doesn't use it. His name is written down, and he doesn't use it. And he introduces himself as James Bond, which Le Chiffre is kind of confused, and Vesper actually gets pissed off because he's not following his cover. Also, people will bring up, but M says she misses the Cold War. Again, I talked about that in film theory and the reboot debunking. Basically, what that is, it's a tongue-in-cheek reference. It's a film theory technique, and real quick, because I've done this already, I'm just referencing it, that the history of Casino Royale, they wanted to do it at the beginning, but they weren't able to get the rights, and so they weren't able to get it till later, 1999, I believe, and that's why they decided to do the film in 2006, and M's comment is a tongue-in-cheek reference to all that, because the book is about the Cold War, and was written during the Cold War, and they wanted to do it back then. Some other evidences that James Bond is not a code name is that if you watch on Her Majesty's Secret Service, when Lazenby resigns and he goes to pick up the phone, he immediately says 007, but then he switches it to James Bond, which basically tells me that because he's resigned, because he's used to saying 007 to answer the phone as his code name, but he resigned. But that habit caused him to say 007 over the phone, and so he had to switch it to James Bond, his real name, because he resigned. Also, in the novel Moonraker, M calls Bond by his Christian name, which would be James Bond. That's your real name. Some mention that, if James Bond was his real name, then him giving it to everybody, they're going to find out who he really is. And they're going to discover, whenever he comes up to somebody and gives his name, then he's going to be killed. Well, that's irrelevant, because let's say James Bond is his code name. And if he's using that all the time, they're going to know who he is anyway. And so you run into the same problem, the same issue. That's why Bond actually does have other code names. And some of Bond's various code names that you'll see are, he is David Somerset in From Russia with Love, Mr. Fisher in You Only Live Twice, Robert Sterling in The Spy Who Loved Me, James Stock in A View to a Kill, Jerzy Bondov in The Living Daylights, Charles Morton in Octopussy, and St. John, or James St. John Smith in A View to a Kill also uses 2 in that one, and there's a lot of others, and you can look at those up online. I'm not going to read off the whole list, but that just shows that 007 is his primary, but he's got all these others, and he's also his real name is actually James Bond. A side note here, and I've seen this online, a lot of people talk about The Rock, and just a brief, real quick thing about that. I call bunk on that. The Sean Connery character from The Rock is not James Bond. They're not even they're not even hinted at. They're not even in the same franchise, nor directors or producers or anything like that. I don't know how to equate it. You might as well say Batman is, or Superman is Iron Man, Anyways, moving on. Lee Tamahori has an interview with and they have a conversation about this, and quite often this is used to try and prove that there's code names. But once again, when you read the interview, it actually debunks the whole thing.